It was late November 1981. Natalie Wood, the beloved star of West Side Story and Rebel Without a Cause, had vanished. The night before, she had been aboard her yacht, the Splendor, anchored off Catalina Island with her husband, Robert Wagner, her co-star, Christopher Walken, and the boat's captain. By morning, she was gone, her body found floating in the Pacific, her life jacket still on board. Her story suddenly changed forever. The headlines called it an accident. The public called it a mystery. And for more than 40 years, those two words have never agreed. Natalie's death became one of Hollywood's darkest legends, a story that refused to sink beneath the waves. Robert Wagner has lived under its shadow ever since. Christopher Walken has remained silent, his name forever linked to a night he's rarely acknowledged. And for millions who still remember the news that Sunday morning, one question has never faded: what really happened aboard the Splendor that night off Catalina Island? Long before the headlines and the speculation, Natalie Wood was Hollywood's proof that a child star could survive the machine and still become something more. Born in 1938 in San Francisco as Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko, she entered film at just 4 years old. Casting directors quickly shortened her name and polished her accent, turning a shy Russian-American girl into an all-American face audiences couldn't forget. By the age of 16, she was sharing the screen with James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, a performance that earned her an Academy Award nomination and introduced the world to a kind of fragility that seemed utterly real. Through the 1950s and 60s, Natalie balanced glamour with vulnerability. In Splendor, In the Grass, and West Side Story, she embodied young love and heartbreak so convincingly that audiences blurred the line between the woman and her characters. Off-camera, she fought for serious roles at a time when studios still treated actresses as ornaments. Directors described her as meticulous, instinctive, and deeply sensitive. Friends remembered how she carried every emotion home with her. Her personal life mirrored the drama of her career. Natalie first married actor Robert Wagner in 1957 when she was just 19. They were one of the industry's most photographed couples, he the polished studio gentleman, she the radiant ingenue who seemed to complete him. But behind the magazine covers lay tension, demanding schedules, gossip columns, and the constant scrutiny that comes with being young, famous, and adored. By 1962, they divorced, citing the same irreconcilable pressures that fame brings to every Hollywood marriage. Natalie later wed British producer Richard Gregson, with whom she had her first daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner. When that marriage ended in the early 70s, life circled back to the man she could never quite forget. She and Wagner remarried in 1972, older now, both carrying the lessons of failed love. Together they welcomed another daughter, Courtney. By all accounts, Natalie seemed determined to build the stable family she'd always wanted. Still, the glamour never left her orbit. She was working again, preparing for a new project with co-star Christopher Walken, an actor from a younger generation, admired for his intensity and edge. The pairing excited producers and tabloids alike. For Natalie, it was a chance to reassert her talent in a changing Hollywood that was moving toward grittier realism and away from the polished studio style she had grown up with. Friends later said she appeared anxious that week in November 1981, tired, reflective, unsure whether to stay in Catalina for the weekend or head home. Yet few imagined how significant those small choices would become. Reports would later note that she had long expressed unease around open water, a detail often repeated but impossible to measure. What mattered most was that she went anyway, hoping for a quiet break among familiar faces. At 43, Natalie Wood had lived the kind of life that left photographs on nearly every coffee table magazine in America. She had survived child fame, heartbreak, reinvention, and still carried the aura of a woman who belonged to another era of Hollywood, the era of grace, danger, and myth. When she stepped onto the Splendor that final weekend, she was not a fading star but a working actress, a wife, a mother, and a woman trying to balance the two worlds she knew best, performance and privacy. What none of them could know was that within 24 hours those two worlds would collide on the dark water off Catalina Island, and Hollywood would never look the same again. The final weekend began on Friday, November 27, 1981. Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner had invited a small circle to spend the holiday aboard their yacht, the Splendor. Among them was actor Christopher Walken, her co-star in the upcoming film Brainstorm. The plan was simple: a quiet escape to Catalina Island, a few days of conversation, wine and calm water before returning to work. For most of the trip, the group appeared relaxed. Witnesses on nearby boats later recalled laughter and music drifting across the harbor. The Splendor's captain, Dennis Davern, prepared meals and helped navigate the short passage from the mainland. Photographs taken that week showed Natalie smiling in a cream-colored coat, bundled against the chill, looking every bit the movie star she had always been. But as night fell on Saturday, the mood shifted. The island was dark, the air colder, and the sea unusually still. The group had dinner at a local restaurant, Doug's Harbor Reef, a well-known spot for visiting boaters. Waitstaff later confirmed the party seemed cheerful but had been drinking heavily. Accounts differ on whether tensions arose between Wagner and Walken. Some say the conversation grew sharp, others that it remained friendly. What is certain is that the four returned to the yacht around 10 that night. From here, the record fragments. According to the official timeline, Natalie went below deck to prepare for bed. Sometime after midnight, the yacht's small inflatable dinghy, the Valiant, was found missing. At 8 o'clock the next morning, a passing boat discovered her body floating face down in the water less than a mile from the Splendor. She was wearing a flannel nightgown, socks, and a red jacket, clothing that suggested she hadn't planned to swim. Investigators concluded she had attempted to secure the dinghy after it came loose and slipped into the water. The Los Angeles County coroner's report at the time cited bruising consistent with accidental drowning. No signs of foul play were found, and the case was closed within weeks. Yet the public could not reconcile the image of Natalie Wood, the glamorous actress afraid of dark water, with the idea that she had simply fallen in. Newspaper front pages turned the story into a national obsession. The yacht became a symbol, a luxury vessel adrift between truth and legend. Every detail, her jacket, the wine, the arguments rumored among the guests, was dissected. Robert Wagner spoke publicly once, describing the night as a terrible accident, then withdrew from interviews. Walken, deeply uncomfortable with the attention, offered a brief statement expressing sadness and refused to comment further. Captain Dennis Davern stayed largely silent for decades. To many, that silence felt heavier than any confession could have. Rumors spread, books appeared, and talk shows debated what really happened between those hours after dinner and the moment the Coast Guard found her. By the end of 1981, the investigation was officially over. Hollywood moved on, but the story never quite sank beneath the surface. Natalie's films returned to television, her smile frozen in an age of color and optimism. Yet whenever her name appeared, so did the image of that yacht and the three people left behind. One was a husband searching for privacy, one was a captain haunted by memory, and one, the actor who stood quietly apart, would carry the weight of that night for the rest of his life. For years, the story of Natalie Wood's death stayed frozen in its first version, an accident, a tragedy, a closed case. But time rarely leaves famous mysteries untouched. As the decades passed, new witnesses spoke, and old voices changed their tone. What had once been a settled conclusion began to reopen, piece by piece. In 2011, 30 years after that weekend off Catalina, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department announced it was taking another look at the evidence. The official reasoning was simple: new information had come forward. Media reports pointed to the Splendor's captain, Dennis Davern, who publicly claimed he had withheld details back in 1981. In interviews and in his later book, Davern said he had heard heated arguments on the yacht that night, and that events unfolded differently from the original report. He also stated he felt pressured, at the time, to accept the accidental drowning theory. Detectives re-examined the autopsy, the bruising, and the timeline of the night. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office amended the death certificate, changing the cause from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. The revised report noted that the bruises on her body were not fully explained by a simple fall. Yet investigators stopped short of calling it homicide. They said only that the circumstances were unclear and that unanswered questions remained. Robert Wagner, by then in his 80s, became labeled a person of interest, not a suspect, but someone whose account required further understanding. He maintained that the loss of his wife had been a nightmare that would never end, and declined public interviews on the subject. Christopher Walken, approached again by reporters, offered no additional comment. The sheriff's office emphasized that no charges were expected unless new, concrete evidence appeared. For the public, the reopening reignited everything. Talk shows revisited the case. Magazines ran retrospectives with faded photographs of the splendor at anchor. Viewers who had lived through the original headlines debated the same question they had asked in 1981. How could someone so experienced on boats vanish so completely? Each new report promised answers but delivered only further uncertainty. The deeper investigators looked, the more the story fractured. Some friends insisted Natalie's fear of water meant she would never have gone out alone at night. Others believed she might have tried to retie the dinghy, unaware of how quickly the current could pull her away. What all sides agreed on was this: the truth of those last moments would likely never be proven. In a sense, the case had become two stories: the official investigation and the one carried in public imagination. One was written in reports and interviews, the other in memories, theories, and grief. Even the detectives admitted that time itself had eroded evidence. Waves, weather, and human recollection had washed away the clarity that once seemed possible. By the late 2010s, the file remained technically open but dormant. The sheriff's department confirmed that without new leads, the case would stay in limbo. It was a quiet ending to a loud mystery, a final pause in a story that had defined Hollywood's darker side. And yet, for those who had lived it, there was no real closure. The investigation may have faded from headlines, but every mention of Natalie Wood's name still brought the same question back to life. What truly happened that night on the water, and why has no one ever been able to say for sure? When official statements grew quiet, other voices began to carry the weight of Natalie Wood's story. Her sister, Lana Wood, became one of them. In the years following the tragedy, Lana spoke openly about her belief that something more had happened that night, something not reflected in the reports. Her comments reignited public interest each time she appeared on television or published a new interview. For many viewers, her determination to keep the case alive became as familiar as the mystery itself. She described her mission not as accusation, but as protection, a promise that her sister's death would never be dismissed as just another Hollywood accident. Lana's persistence often placed her at odds with Robert Wagner, who had chosen silence over debate. While he moved away from the public eye, focusing on family and the occasional acting appearance, Lana kept speaking. She said she wanted answers, not headlines, but the media rarely made that distinction. Every time she revisited the story, headlines turned sharp. Sister demands truth. For audiences who had followed the case since the 80s, it reignited old emotions, loyalty, suspicion, and grief. Natalie's daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner, offered a different voice entirely. Barely 11, when her mother died, she grew up surrounded by questions she hadn't asked. As an adult, she took a gentler approach, focusing not on the mystery, but on preserving her mother's humanity. In her memoir and later in the documentary Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, she painted a portrait of a woman who loved deeply, feared deeply, and tried to protect her children from the chaos of fame. Natasha acknowledged the pain of public speculation, describing how the world had taken ownership of a story that belonged in truth to her family. She has spoken with compassion about both her parents, refusing to vilify her stepfather Robert Wagner, while never ignoring the loss that defined her childhood. In interviews, she said that reopening the investigation did not bring her peace, celebrating her mother's life did. That tone of forgiveness shifted the conversation again, moving it from accusation to reflection. Meanwhile, the public continued to hold its own dialogue. For some, Natalie's death symbolized the dark underside of Hollywood, the price of beauty, fame, and control. For others, it became a lesson in how myth and truth can merge until no one can separate them. Viewers who remembered her films often spoke of how alive she seemed on screen, how impossible it was to reconcile that vitality with the quiet horror of her final hours. Each generation rediscovered the story differently. Older audiences remembered the shock of the morning papers. Younger ones found it through documentaries and online archives, where footage of the splendor sat beside photos of Natalie in her prime. The digital age gave new life to an old question. Even with the case technically open, no one expected new evidence. Yet thousands of comments under every video, article, and documentary showed how deeply people still cared. For Lana, the story remained about justice. For Natasha, it became about legacy. And for the millions who had watched Natalie Wood grow up on screen, it was about loss, the kind that never really leaves the water. 4 decades later, the investigation had cooled, but the conversation never did. And behind all those voices, one question lingered: why does this story still matter so much to the people who lived through it? After the splendor drifted back to shore, Hollywood was not the same. The death of Natalie Wood did more than close a chapter on a beloved actress. It marked the end of a kind of innocence the industry had long hidden behind its glamour. Until that night in 1981, the mythology of movie stars had remained intact, larger than life, untouched by ordinary tragedy. But when Natalie's name appeared beside words like drowning, investigation, and unanswered, it shattered that illusion. Suddenly, Hollywood's brightest faces looked mortal. The splendor became more than a yacht. It became a symbol of what fame could not protect against: miscommunication, fear, and the fragile balance between love and control. For actors and producers of the time, the shock was personal. Many had known her, worked beside her, or grown up watching her films. In studios and backlots, conversations turned quiet. It was no longer about contracts or gossip columns. It was about what happens when a legend dies in confusion, and no one can explain why. Over the following years, the industry began to speak more openly about safety and responsibility, both on set and off. The idea that stars were invincible had faded. Publicists encouraged their clients to avoid excessive drinking, to keep entourages smaller, to think about how perception could shape reality. Insurance clauses for film productions changed. Journalists wrote less about scandal and more about accountability. The shift was subtle but lasting. Natalie's death had shown how fast a reputation could sink, even among people who had seemed untouchable. The story also changed how audiences consumed celebrity news. In earlier decades, fan magazines had protected Hollywood's secrets. After 1981, tabloids and television began dissecting tragedy with forensic curiosity. People wanted explanations, not fairy tales. Viewers who had grown up with Natalie on their screens were now older, reflective, and wary of the price their idols paid for beauty and success. It was as if the golden age had ended not with a studio closure but with a boat adrift in the dark. The tragedy also deepened how filmmakers approached fame itself. By the late 80s, directors were exploring darker, more introspective stories about stardom, films that questioned illusion, loyalty, and truth. Many critics later pointed out that Natalie's death marked a turning point in tone, from the optimism of mid-century cinema to the realism that defined later decades. Her story, though unintentional, had rewritten the emotional vocabulary of Hollywood. For those who worked alongside her, the pain endured. Walken continued to act, often choosing roles defined by mystery and introspection. Wagner retreated into family life and occasional television work. Neither could escape the shadow of the splendor. It followed them quietly, reappearing every few years when the case resurfaced. The boat itself was eventually sold, repainted and renamed, yet its history clung to it like salt to wood. For Natalie's fans, the splendor became something else, a vessel carrying their collective grief. They spoke of it not as evidence but as metaphor, a reminder that behind fame lies fragility, and behind legend lies loneliness. Every time the anniversary came around, old footage would return to air, and the same question would echo across generations. How could someone so luminous, so loved, disappear so completely into silence? That question ensured the Splendor's place in history, not as a crime scene but as the boat that changed Hollywood forever. More than 4 decades have passed since Natalie Wood's body was pulled from the cold Pacific near Catalina Island. The files remain open, the questions remain familiar, and the people who once knew her best now live in the long shadow of a story that refuses to rest. Every few years, headlines reappear, documentaries revisit the night, and the public returns to that same image: the calm water, the splendor, and the star who never came back. What we know is clear. Natalie Wood, age 43, boarded the yacht with her husband, her co-star, and the captain. By morning, she was gone. The coroner's findings, revised decades later, acknowledged uncertainty, but confirmed only that she drowned. The sheriff's department has said the investigation could reopen if new evidence emerges. It never has. What we don't know is everything else. The sound of that night, the sequence of moments between laughter and loss, the truth of who saw what, all of it vanished with time. The water preserved nothing. Memories blurred. What remains are fragments, official reports, conflicting recollections, and the uneasy silence of those who were there. Each fragment tells part of the story, yet together they form no single truth. For her family, the search for understanding became part of their lives. Natasha Gregson Wagner found peace not in answers but in remembrance, turning her mother's life back into celebration. Lana Wood held fast to her determination to seek clarity, knowing each interview reopened old wounds. Both women carried different versions of grief, bound by the same loss. For Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken, the past never left. Wagner built a quiet life, seldom addressing the tragedy except to call it a terrible accident. Walken continued to act, his career untouched, but his name forever attached to a night he never wished to revisit. Their lives became separate stories linked by one shared memory. In the end, the legacy of Natalie Wood's death may lie less in the mystery than in what it revealed about fame itself. It stripped away the idea that Hollywood was a fortress of perfection. It showed that even its brightest figures lived with fear, love, and human flaws. The tragedy made clear that behind the lights and glamour, truth is fragile, and sometimes it sinks beyond recovery. Still, something about Natalie endures. Perhaps it's the warmth of her performances, the sadness in her eyes, or the feeling that she belonged to a gentler era of storytelling. Audiences who watch her today are struck not by scandal but by presence. Every scene she ever filmed feels like a moment borrowed from a life that ended too soon. And so the story remains, part fact, part folklore, always incomplete. The sea keeps its secrets, and Hollywood keeps its legends. What's left for the rest of us is remembrance, a woman who could light up a screen, a family who still speaks her name, and a mystery that no investigation could ever solve. For more emotional stories, check out this video.